How y'all doing? Good, good. All right, big plans for Saturday night, I'm sure. Paint the town of San Jose red, as it were. So my name is Jamin Warren. I am the founder of a video game arts and culture company called Killscreen. I'm not sure if I should sit or I could like sit on the edge of the table. Does that no? All right, I'll stand up. So I run a video game arts and culture company called Killscreen. I'll give you a little bit of background, and then we'll kind of get into the meat of the thing. So I used to be a reporter at the Wall Street Journal. I covered arts and entertainment for them for about 5 years, and they had tasked me with basically covering, what the kids are up to, I guess. So that was everything from virtual blood drive donations in Second Life to, MySpace's battle against Facebook. This was a story that I filed. It was called "How Facebook Plans to Catch MySpace," which was an open question at the time. I'm really curious how it turned out long term. Christopher Hitchens, who's no longer with us either, he knows what happened. Anyway, so I covered a jump rope team from North Carolina called the Bouncing Bulldogs as they faced off against the Japanese at the Apollo Theater in Harlem. The Japanese crushed them. It was very sad for everyone. But I started getting really interested in games like this one, games like BioShock, kind of discovering in the mid-aughts that, sort of this medium that I love was really starting to grow up with me, which was really exciting. So there's a bunch of really amazing stuff that was happening at kind of like the big games level. But then you also had, smaller, more personal games. Ones like Braid, for example, which again was really eye-opening for me, just in terms of, being able to discover that this medium that I love was all of a sudden starting to grow up. I think the other big thing for me was that, games like this, particularly the smaller ones, kind of opened up my eyes in terms of the idea that games could be about personal experiences, that you could make games about love and loss and longing and all these different things that I know that games ostensibly could and ultimately should do. Because, when we were playing games like The Legend of Zelda, for example, when I was a kid, I wasn't necessarily thinking that there was like a personal story behind it, when in fact a lot of this game was based on Miyamoto's journeys through different caves in the Kyoto region. This was not taped by him. This was just what you find when you type in Kyoto cave exploration into YouTube. But in any case, there wasn't a connect for me that you could sort of have games that could do really interesting and personal things. So I put this all together and basically decided I'm going to make a big pitch to my editor to try and tell them that the Wall Street Journal should be writing about video games on a regular basis. Put this giant proposal together, and this was basically his answer. He said, "I don't get this video games thing," which, probably should have been a good first sign, I guess. And they shuttled me off to cover television, which apparently was another cultural backwater as well. So that was really confusing for me because you had big games like Grand Theft Auto that were making, millions and millions of dollars, and were trying to ostensibly have some, more meaningful conversations with the medium. And yet I felt like there was this big gap between the world of games that I was seeing and what was actually out there. So I started a company called Killscreen. Just a brief primer on Killscreen. We have a magazine that'll be out next year. It's a tentative cover. We try to cover mostly a lot of independent stuff. We run a daily website, kind of looking at the ins and outs of independent game design. We have weekly playlists. We do a great event ourselves called 256, where we get people from inside and outside of games to talk about a set of common issues. That's Kara Stone, who's a game designer, on stage with the chief product officer for OkCupid, talking about digital intimacy and sex. So that was a lot of fun for us. We're doing a VR conference next year, and I think the reason I ended up here is because I host a show for PBS Digital Studios called Game Show, which was magically not taken. I'm not sure how that is possible. Many years into the life of YouTube, when you typed in Game Show, you got a lot of $25,000 pyramid, or how many thousand, is 10,000, 5,000? Anyway, that pyramid game, that pyramid show. Anyway, so when I describe what it is that I do, I tell people that I run a video game arts and culture company. And a lot of times people kind of like, well, what is that? And it's not the arts part that's really confusing for people, but I think it's this idea that games could be some kind of culture. Because the arts part, I think for all of you in the room, you've probably all known this for quite some time. There's games in the Smithsonian and MoMA and all of these other cultural institutions. But it's the culture part that is ultimately a little bit confusing for people. And it's something that I spend a lot of time thinking about. And I think for a lot of you all, you probably spend some time thinking about it as well. So if we do a little thought experiment, if you close your eyes, for example, and so everybody close their eyes, and I say the word gamer, and then think of what you think a gamer looks like and what you think the rest of the world maybe thinks a gamer looks like. Okay, and open your eyes. It might look something kind of like this, right? The left-hand side, that was taken here. I don't know if you all knew that. I'm just kidding, it wasn't. The one on the right-hand side was. Obviously there's different perceptions about what gamer culture ultimately is, where it's going, but this idea of identity and what it means to be someone who plays games is incredibly important, and it's something that I started spending a lot more time thinking about. If you go to gaming conventions and find people who share your passions, that's one expression of games, but obviously there's a lot of different gaming conventions as well. And then there was that thing that happened last year, right? And that, for me, really cemented this really incredibly important question about what culture, ostensibly what culture means. Because for me, I think a lot of the stuff that we've been seeing online, part of it's a moral failure. I think obviously on the part of people in the games industry, kind of allowing this sort of unspoken hatred to sort of live for quite some time. It's a technical failure of large systems and their inability to protect people and the people who use them. But I think really, at the end of the day, it's really a cultural failure, right? That you have all these people who have this shared passion and they're not able to communicate with each other, interact with each other in a way that's meaningful. And that's, I think, obviously a really big problem. And then for people outside of games, insofar as you know what that thing that happened last year actually is, maybe you don't really understand what's going on. Maybe you think that people who play games, this is just kind of how they are. So it's this strange thing. It was this really, really strange thing for me to see, these poisonous ideas that were being spread, and it was really difficult, I think, for obviously for a lot of different people. But here's the thing. At least one of the things that I sort of things that I noticed is that coming out of this particular experience, we sort of ended up having this like baseline level in terms of like how we engage online. You can kind of think of it as like being this like giant sort of like champagne tower sort of thing, right? Where you sort of have 4chan, kind of, 4chan and sort of the internet, as it were, and then that kind of like spills over into the world of games, and then that kind of like spills over to like us, and then it kind of like spills over to like your mom and everybody else, right? And it just, in terms of like how we dialogue with each other online, it's unfortunate. I feel like the baseline has become, I don't know, more profoundly negative. I don't know if that's something that's always been there, but it's certainly been my experience. So let me give you one example. I was watching Seinfeld. I don't know if y'all can see this. So I was watching Seinfeld with my wife, as we often do. I like Seinfeld a lot, and obviously it has a lot of its problems. One of its problems, obviously, is a lack of diversity in its characters. And so there's a particular episode called The Visa with this character named Babu, that's him on the right, and Jerry keeps, like everyone else in Seinfeld, keeps destroying this poor man's life. He gives him bad recommendations about the restaurant that he should open. His visa application gets delivered to Jerry, and Jerry forgets to take it to the post office, and he ends up getting deported, et cetera, et cetera. Hijinks and hilarity ensue. Anyway, so I was really curious. I was like, it's kind of one of these things where you ask yourself a question and you probably know what the answer is. I was like, he's playing a Pakistani guy. I'm just curious, like, maybe he's Pakistani. Nah, he's not. And so I went and looked at the other the ostensibly Pakistani characters who were supposed to be in the show, and they, they were not Pakistani either. So I did, as many people do, I turned to Twitter, right, to vent my frustrations about this. So I love Seinfeld. This was really hard to get into the character. A lot of creative punctuation went into this. So I love Seinfeld. I was watching this 1993 episode called The Visa, about Babu, a Pakistani played by an Israeli, different country entirely, just someone with dark skin. Other two Pakistanis, one's a Trinidadian, the other one's last name is Hamlin. I don't know, maybe he is Pakistani, I can't say. ugh, right? And I think one of the people who likes it is actually here. Yeah, exactly. Anything race in Seinfeld, Sean will like be there to like your tweet. In any case, 4 hours later, Hazel Murphy shows up and says, "Does it make you go ugh to see Idris Elba play American characters?" You know, not the most offensive, you know, not like the most disrespectful thing on the planet, but the tone is like super negative. It's like baiting. It's just like asking me to respond, right? And the way I would normally think about these sorts of things, like this is kind of like what's going through my head.
Let's not make this political, Terry. Do we know what this giant head wants?
Show me what you got.
Jim, you heard them said, show me what you got.
Show me what you got. I want to see what you got.
Right, so that's like what I'm feeling is like, you know, this giant disembodied head on the internet. I like to descend and destroy this person in 140 character form. And you know what? I think at the end, it feels really good, right? Like, feels awesome. You're like sick burn, you're getting likes and retweets, like maybe some other, you know, maybe you'll get picked up by like, you know, that mic or something, like see what this person did on Twitter to someone who said something terrible, right? That's the dream, sort of the hope. And I think that's when we think really positively about this. Like, yeah, this is great. I could be the person who, with wrath, will just change this person's entire self-concept and just destroy them, right? Then on the other side, it's like, you know, sometimes when I think about it, it's kind of like the thin red line, right? Like, what can one person do in the face of all of this madness? And so typically I was like kind of I'm more on the pessimistic side, like, you know, does engaging with people like actually make a difference? Does it actually change their minds? Like, seems better just to ignore people outright or, you know, do whatever, block them, et cetera, et cetera. And then I read this story in the New Yorker, came out a couple weeks ago. So this woman, her name is Megan Phelps Roper. Most people probably don't know who she is, but they're familiar with the organization that she was a part of, the Westboro Baptist Church, who were obviously God hates blank, whatever. You can kind of pick what goes in there. Actually, this works really well because you can just add other things in there, right? You just say like God hates pies, which is unfortunate because I actually like pies. Anyway, so TLDR version of this story, it's excellent. You should read it. It's by Adrian Chen, who's a phenomenal reporter. Megan Phelps Roper, she grew up in Westboro Baptist Church, started at a very young age, kind of picketing basically everything, you know, dead soldiers, dead celebrities, whatever it might be. You know, obviously Westboro Baptist Church is there to basically make everyone feel really terrible. And then sort of in 2000, I guess like 2008, she discovers this new online tool. It's called Twitter, and discovers that all of a sudden she could say really terrible, hateful things to other people, and they would respond, right? Sometimes positively, like, yeah, that's right, and sometimes, most of the time, really negatively, right? But it gave her an opportunity to sort of engage without the filter of, you know, other journalists or other people, to engage with like the outside world. And that was a really, really new thing for her. The problem is, well, I guess depending on how you define problem, is that the door swings both ways, right? So she's able to sort of say things to the world, and the world is actually able to talk back to her. And so one of the people who did, which is this fella, his name is David Abitol. He runs a blog called Jewlicious, and yeah, God also apparently hates Jews as well. So he was a target, and so they would debate back and forth, kind of, you know, the merits, as it were, of sort of Megan's position. And it was people like him and other people on Twitter who sort of engaged with her ideas that actually led her to leave the church entirely. And that's what the story is about, is that she basically has this conversion through Twitter. And so, which is obviously, you know, amazing. But there's like this part of me that's like, you know, like, but really, does this really, this is like one time that this happened with this one person, does this really sort of happen on a regular basis? And that's like, that's kind of sort of me when I'm trying to be honest with myself. It's like, does that really happen? So as I was prepping for this talk, so that got me really thinking, as I was thinking about how I engage with other people, what are some of the ways that you can sort of get people, hopefully, to, I don't know, maybe they're not always going to agree with you, but how maybe you can work with people who are sitting on the other fence entirely. So I got three things that I'd like to talk about. So the first one, this is the most important one, which is why I started with this one, is to respond with love. Always, 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 I think, respond with love. I'm going to ask you a question, like how many of you get like, really, really angry about the way you get treated from time to time online? I mean, me, right? Yeah. You get like really, really like furiously angry, right? And it's frustrating and hard and sad, and people say really terrible things about you. And you want to have this response where you want them to feel that anger at the same time. But there's a reason, there's some philosophical reasons, but also some different reasons why it's really important to respond with love. So this guy, his name is Jeffrey Lin. He's a lead social systems designer at Riot Games. Riot Games makes an incredibly popular game called League of Legends. And his job, he was a professor, associate professor at the University of Washington. And one of the things that he was tasked with, because League of Legends, when it started, basically had a really toxic community. Like a lot of online games, they had a real problem with people just being jerks and saying a lot of really nasty, hateful things to each other. And what happens is that new players come in, they have really negative experiences, and then they never come back. So obviously there's like, business reasons why you want people to behave well online, but there's also, moral reasons. You're a human being, you're part of the society, you want to sort of create a safe space for people to actually play a game like League of Legends and actually be okay doing it. And so one of the things that they found is really interesting is that if you looked at like online citizens more broadly, online citizens who played League of Legends, and you classified their behavior like from negative to positive, the vast majority of like the negative behavior, which for them would range from like trash talk to like non-extreme but still generally offensive behavior, it didn't originate from persistently negative people, right? So like if you think of the worst multiplayer, the worst multiplayer gamer on the planet, that's not actually who was responsible for well over 85% of the negative things that were said online. In fact, 87% of the online toxicity came from neutral and positive people. So people who generally speaking were like actually good actors. So like this is a chart that they put together. There's an amazing, you should read there's a big PDF report that they've released from time to time. But basically if you looked at like sort of severity games over time, a lot of those peaks basically came from people who were just basically having like a bad day. They're not like people who in their regular lives are like actively going out. Now look, some of these people are like complete assholes, right? That's a given, right? But the vast majority of people who do this, like there's someone whose mind it probably can be convinced. And to make it more practical, this is a stock photo, by the way, of road rage. When you type in road rage in the Google, it's amazing, it's wonderful photos. But this is probably an experience that a lot of you have had at some point in time, right? Where you're a really good person, but then sometimes behind the wheel of a car, maybe you get, maybe that's why Uber exists, I guess, is so that sort of to get us off the road, maybe, so people can just scream from the back seat. But most people are like good drivers most of the time, but then sometimes they get a little bit nuts. And part of the problem is that like, it's not really fair, right? Because it places this tremendous burden on people like us to sort of behave well all of the time, right? Every interaction becomes incredibly, incredibly important. Because the reality is like you often don't know when you see negative things being said to you. You don't know the context in which that person said things. I've gotten notes from people from PBS Game Show where they say, I'm really sorry about that comment that I left that one time. I'm going through a bunch of stuff. And this is how I sort of express myself. I think one of the models for that obviously is the civil rights movement. And I think for me, I don't know what the online equivalent of the civil rights movement is just yet, but I think a lot of the tactics that they use can be really effective. There's a great long quote from Dr. Martin Luther King, and he talks a lot about the fact that the nonviolent resistor, people like him, did not seek to humiliate or defeat the opponent, basically the show me what you got approach that I always want to do. But they try to win friendship and understanding. and that their goal was not to humiliate people, but to win the friendship of all persons. And so he's got this great quote. He says, "The end of violence or the aftermath of violence is bitterness. The aftermath of nonviolence is reconciliation and the creation of beloved community." And he says that a boycott is never an end within itself. It is merely a means to awaken a sense of shame within the oppressor, but the end is reconciliation. The end is redemption. And I think that should ostensibly be our goal. One sort of practical way in which this plays out, I don't know if you all know, they're changing their name. I don't know if you guys knew that, but Steph Curry. Anyway, so I was thinking about this a lot. So this term gets thrown around a lot, right? Social justice warriors, right? And that's created, it's meant to be negative, right? The idea is to sort of paint the picture of these like wild crusaders who are fighting for, the rights and, all that stuff at any cost, et cetera, et cetera. But it's also sort of claimed by people sort of as a mantle as well. And I think it's one of these ways in which, like, if you think about the term warrior, for example, implies that there are winners and that there are losers. And I think that the language with which we sometimes paint ourselves, I think, is incredibly, incredibly important. All right, number 2, and this one is a little bit strange, I have to admit, so please hear me out. Okay, so, and this applies I think just to the world of games. I don't think it applies necessarily more broadly. But one of the things I've been thinking about is this idea that we should argue about games and not necessarily politics. But in the end, you're also kind of arguing about politics, so I'll get there too. Because you can, games in a lot of ways are political expressions. This dawned on me. I was doing an episode called "What is a Game?" And Why It Matters. And the reason why is because one of my favorite games last year was this game called Mountain. It was created by this guy named David O'Reilly. You play as a mountain. You are a mountain. Things happen to the mountain. It sings songs to you. It's wonderful. In any case, a lot of people didn't necessarily think that was like a game. And it's something you see levied against a game like Everybody's Gone to the Rapture, for example, as well, right? Where people sort of accuse it of being a walking simulator. One of the critiques of this game was that you couldn't run. That was a big problem for people, was that you couldn't run to the apocalypse. I'm not sure why it's a problem. That bike, you can't ride it. You gotta walk through the whole thing. And so I did this episode, and the idea was to help try to give, because I do a lot of work on YouTube, and so a lot of times I'm engaging with people, who maybe don't see eye to eye with me about different types of things, but my hope is to be able to, open their minds a little bit about the way they can think about games, at least conceptually. So I did this episode, and one of the things I introduced was this idea that, when you're asking this question, like, well, what is a game? You can sort of think about this on two sort of poles. You have abstractionists who think about games as being a form of experience versus formalists who think about games as rules and systems or whatever. And that's really what's at the heart of it, is that you're kind of on one of these two camps or maybe somewhere in between. The reality is, though, and this is still from Gone Home, the reality is that this question of like, well, that's not a game, right? Well, that's not a game. It really only gets levied against like certain types of games, right? So it's like Twine games or Anna Anthropy's games or games like Gone Home, which if it hadn't been about, a social issue, I don't think people would have had a problem with it, right? And so what happens is you have this discussion with people. It's like, well, that's not really a game. You're not really a gamer because you play X, Y, and Z thing. So on the one hand, obviously terrible, right? On the one hand, it's very small-minded. But on the other hand, this is a tremendous, tremendous opportunity. In negotiation, there's this term. It's called the pool of shared meaning. And the idea of like the pool of shared meaning is that when you're going to have a difficult conversation with somebody, it's very helpful to figure out what points of contact you sort of share and then work from that base towards some kind of resolution, right? The nice thing about a lot of the debates that we have in the world of games, the existence of this, this conference, this festival, for example, is that the one thing that we all have in common, regardless of how you feel about LGBT issues, is that you love games, right? There's this weird thing that like not all gamers are trolls, but all trolls are gamers, right? Like there's this, the one thing that you actually share with other people is even those people who sort of don't like you, they hate you, they say terrible things about you, is that you actually like games. And I think that can be an incredibly powerful thing. And the reason why is it comes from this guy. His name's Brendan Nyhan. He's a professor at Dartmouth University. He was a political science professor, and he was really interested in really interested in why people don't change their minds. He was really interested in particularly like false belief systems, so like people who don't believe that climate change is a man-made phenomenon and we're the only ones who can fix it, right? In the face of, insurmountable data, why is it that some people still cling to this idea, or that, Barack Obama was not born in the United States, like that sort of thing, right? And so he was, he started studying all these different people who sort of cling to these ideas and they argue about it online. And the thing they found, it had nothing to do with like political affiliations. The thing they found, it had to do entirely with their self-identity. So when people sort of hold on to these belief systems that are so patently wrong, it's because they're having this inner dialogue about this question. It's like, what kind of person am I? What kind of person do I want to be? All ideologies were sort of treated the same way. And so his theory was basically that when people's sense of self feels like threatened by the outside world, they're strongly motivated to correct that misperception. And they do that in one of two ways. One is by like reasoning away the inconsistency, right? That's like one way they go about doing it. Or they modify their behavior. So when people think about like, when they think about like what is a gamer or what is games, there's an opportunity to engage with them, because if you can demonstrate that you're a part of the same family of game-loving people, they have to confront this fact, right? They have to deal with it. And then you can have conversations with them about things like the no true Scotsman fallacy, which is a great fallacy to trot out. It basically works like this. The no true Scotsman fallacy basically says, if person A says, no Scotsman puts sugar on their porridge, and then person B says, but my uncle Angus likes sugar with his porridge. Then person A says, yes, but no true Scotsman puts sugar on their porridge, right? And you see this a lot in games where people say, oh, real games are about mechanics. And then you're like, well, I really like Gone Home because there are puzzles in it. Aren't puzzles a mechanic? And then someone says, oh, well, it's not just mechanics and a host of other like social issues as well. Or you can ask them questions like, how would you go about defining games? Again, this is like one thing we actually have in common with a lot of different people, is that you can engage them through their game playing selves. So if you see someone online who's like really crazy about dead or alive beach volleyball, you can ask them some pretty pointed questions about it. It's like, all right, defend that for me. How do you feel about the gameplay of that sort of thing? Like really, you can engage people on that level because they're not expecting you to. I mentioned Megan Phelps earlier, and there's an interesting side note in that story. Sort of the pivot point in that story for her transformation was one of many different things, but there was one thing in particular that really got her to change her mind. It's the most unexpected thing on the planet. It's actually words with friends. That's what sort of changed her mind, believe it or not. She met somebody on Twitter, and she was kind of spitting Bible passages at this person, and this person was like, well, I can't answer that question, but I've never been beaten at Words with Friends, and they started playing Words with Friends together, and she actually kind of starts to fall in love with them a little bit, and then things get really rocky, and she pulls back entirely. But the idea that this would happen through our game-playing selves, I think, is a really, really powerful thing. It's probably the most, it's probably the most socially responsible thing Zynga has ever been responsible for, I guess. They might want to think about, changing the name of the game maybe to Words with Enemies. It could be a conflict resolution tool. I don't know. If it happens, I guess I'll invoice them later. I don't know. All right, third thing. So be a community, not a clique. I think it's a really important distinction. There's this theorist, his name's Henry Tajfel. There he is in pixelated glory on the left-hand side. And so in the early 80s, he's a social psychologist. I've referenced him a lot, actually, in Game Show, because I think his thinking about groups is actually incredibly important and very valuable. So he encountered something that he called in-group favoritism. That was his words, which means that we tend to favor people who are basically in our group. Seems like kind of obvious, right? Because groups give us identity and they give us self-esteem. And these groups, and here's the crazy thing. So he does all these experiments on people to figure out like what constitutes a group. And what he says is like, basically that these groups can be formed on almost like next to nothing. Like he had two different groups of people flip coins, and then the people who flipped heads actually favored other people who flipped heads over the people who flipped tails. It was like death to heads, death to tails. Like these are people who have nothing in common except the fact that they flipped a coin, and yet they demonstrate the same kind of like, we need to like, circle the horses kind of deal. So there's a flip side to this. It's called out-group derogation. So that's the flip side to in-group favoritism. And, the in-group favoritism thing doesn't really seem so bad, right? But imagine someone from the outside, broadly construed, comes along and tells you that, this castle that you've built with your friends, it has some structural flaws, at least in their eyes or whatever. So what do you do? Outgroup derogation basically means that you sort of rally your own and, really defend what you have and fight out against other people. It means that you perceive people outside of your group as being a threat. So here's the thing. It actually works both ways. And when I read this, I think, oh yeah, that's those kinds of people, right? But the fact that I am doing that means that I'm doing this as well, right? And so this creates, I think it does create a lot of problems. So this is a visualization that was done by Andy Bio and another data visualizer. It was basically 2 weeks, I think it was like 2 weeks of Gamergate tweets, and they wanted to figure out like what the sort of system that it was in place to sort of describe this behavior, because it was at least at some level very different from things that like online researchers had seen before. Andy runs an incredible festival called XOXO that I highly encourage everyone to apply for if they can. Anyway, so he's analyzing these tweets and trying to figure out like what does conversation, as it were, look like between these two different sort of camps. And it looks exactly as you might expect. On the left-hand side, you have the Gamergators, right? And on the right-hand side, you have the anti-Gamergators. And then on the outside is kind of like everybody else, all those little dots. They're not engaged with the issue at all. But what you see is basically you sort of have these two groups that are, the Gamergators in particular, they talk a lot amongst themselves. The anti-Gamergators, not so much. They tend to be much more diffuse. But the one thing that you can see is that people are not really talking to each other, right? In either direction. It's a common thing. It's not like you see a lot of outbound like pink activity towards the green or a ton of outbound green activity towards the pink. These are basically two groups that are essentially passing in the night. And so the question is, like, how do we be people in the middle who are talking across issues, right? And that's a real challenge because it makes yourself vulnerable, and the outcome is not always unsure. And one of the things that I find is really difficult, if you have a meaningful interaction with someone or you respond with love or whatever, you may never hear from them again, right? And then you have no idea what's going to happen. It happens to me all the time. I try to say something nice, and who knows where that person went? Account's deleted, it's turned to an egg or whatever, and I never see them again, and you never really know. But it is incredibly important. So just a couple things, I think, in closing. Zoe Quinn was here earlier. She gave a great talk at XOXO that I would highly encourage everyone to watch if they haven't gotten a chance. It's on YouTube. And one of the things that she says, she talks a lot about her sort of personal, kind of like, the things that she was dealing with when she was a teenager. And one of the things she says that I think is incredibly profound is that if Gamergate had happened several years ago to someone else, I would have been on that side. And she's kind of talking about this idea that, she would have been one of these people that just kind of, she sees sympathy, she sees herself in a lot of the madness that's out there. So I have like I have a similar story. I've never told this story before, so you all, it's incredibly embarrassing story, not in a funny way. I grew up in a very conservative kind of Christian household, not like Westboro Baptist Church, but definitely in the kind of like marriages for a man and a woman kind of deal. And so when I was a teenager, that was the way that I thought about the world. That was just kind of how it was. And so I did speech and debate, which I really liked a lot. I liked arguing with other people, I guess. And there was a style of speech and debate called parliamentary debate, where you would basically, I can't remember, it was like student congress or something like that. And you would basically sort of have a resolution, and you would sort of argue about the merits of a resolution, and then you would take a vote at the end. And one of the things that came up when I was in high school was this resolution about whether or not gay marriage should be legalized. And me, being the enlightened 16-year-old that I was one of like 3 people who argued against it, which is obviously horrible, terrible. And it was really, it's just a horrible thing. It was a horrible thing that I thought in the past. What changed? Well, I went to college, like a lot of people do. I went to college and started to engage with people with different ideas, and started to think sort of differently around the world. I think one of the big things for me was, that it wasn't like this thing where there was this like bolt of lightning and all of a sudden my mind basically changed. It was like moving to New York and having dinner with a gay couple upstairs, and these sorts of things over time changed my mind. It's obviously like really hard. I've talked about this with my wife. Obviously, I wish I wasn't that kid who thought that way about the world. It's obviously like not an excuse in any real way. And the reason that I'm telling you this story is there's hope, right? That like I was that really stupid 16-year-old who thought negatively about, about this particular community. I was that person who had terrible ideas about the world. And so when you're having these conversations with people on the other side, obviously, I've turned into a very, very different person. Like the things that we talk about on PBS Game Show, we try to be as open-minded as possible. And it's something I have to remind myself of, that, that there is this hope out there that people can ultimately change. But obviously, you can't want more for people than they want for themselves. That there are people out there, they're clueless, they're hopeless, sometimes, just like me, but people can change. But sometimes you just have to give them time. Anyway, all right, thank you. Am I allowed questions? Can I do questions? Does anybody have any questions? Yes, I'm gonna sit down for questions.
Thank you. Total brain fart. Yeah, I have a question. There's this really old internet adage which goes something like, don't read the comments ever. Especially on YouTube, it tends to add. And I've noticed that that's something that PBS Game Show and the other PBS sister shows tend to break very gleefully and with great abandon. And I've noticed also that recently most of the comment sections that I find most enjoyable, especially on things relating to social issues, are those which are very, very heavily moderated, which is absolutely not the case on YouTube. So I've also noticed a lot of people trying to, even the straight white cis dudes doing video game criticism and that sort of thing, trying to redirect their YouTube comments towards something more like a subreddit, something more easy to moderate. So basically, I guess what I'm asking is, given that you interact with YouTube comments quite frequently, what are your thoughts on the relative merits of moderated versus unmoderated comments? Do you have to do any moderation on your YouTube comment section? Do you find that the community self-moderates fairly well? Just what do you think about that?
Yeah, no, it's a very good question. So let's see. So we initially didn't, and then we did a pre-Gamergate episode on Anita Sarkeesian, and then that just opened the floodgates. And it was really, I think, what sucks is there were 10,000 comments or something, which is a lot, and it was basically 3 people responsible for a third of them, which is insane. Several thousand people. So that got us thinking a lot differently. I think one of the things that's really challenging is, Anil Dash, who's a web theorist, and he has this great quote. He's if your website's full of assholes, it's your fault, right? If you run a bar and people there are assholes, you don't say well, that's just kind of how they are. You do something about it, right? And that can take a lot of different forms. So the thing that we found that's worked for our show, and I guess it's 2 different things. I guess one is more explicit and one's implicit. One is we do have a content filter for certain words, right? And then those get moderated and we decide which ones. And that's a lot slower, obviously. But I think that, leaving a comment obviously is a privilege, not a right. If the expectation is I need my voice heard immediately, then that's probably not the right way to be thinking about your thoughts, right? It also turns out that when people use certain words, they're not really doing, almost universally, we found almost universally, when people are cursing at one another, it's almost always, and maybe because that's just the nature of our show, it's almost always saying something really nasty or hateful. So that's more of an explicit thing that we're able to do. The more implicit thing has been, we try to integrate comments into the life of the show itself. So I think that gives the sense that, at least for consistent viewers, that we're watching, not in an ominous sort of way, but that we pay attention, and that what happens below the fold is still part of the conversation. That said, I really wish that YouTube would allow for, we can't have a community manager. It's not something that YouTube allows us to do. So I can't assign, because I can't be on the comments every day, all day, and I can't assign someone, so we have to like make do by like having other people chime in, and then they can just like add their name or what. YouTube doesn't really have a lot of the tools in place to allow us to do some of the things that we want to do, which is why you see people going to places like Reddit and things like that. But I think the combination of those two things has worked really well. It's like use the sort of algorithmic stuff to kind of like deal with the breadth, and then use the sort of responding to the comments to deal with the depth, I guess. Yeah. One in the back.
I was wondering if you've ever experienced blowback from people who see Gamergate or other topics like this as an issue, as opposed to the individuals behind the issue, who feel like it's giving it validation or credibility to even address it the way you're describing. Because I really agree with what you're recommending, but I've heard from people that it's dangerous to validate it, and I'm just curious if you have experienced that too.
Yeah, I mean, the thing is, like, it was always there, right? So it's kind of like when you give something a name, you can give it a place, right? So I think being able to create, I mean, that is one of the, it's not a positive thing in the sense that there's now a place where people who feel a certain way about these issues can go and like they can engage with one another. The flip side of that is that it does, I think people are smart enough now to know the difference between like someone who plays games and a gamergater. So I haven't necessarily felt that way necessarily, but I'm also in a very different position. You know, being a straight cis male, right? That is a very different position for me. I mean, I feel like it does present opportunities sort of to, you know, where somebody sort of stands. And when you have something that you can sort of, you can contextualize something that allows you to sort of like engage with it. But I can also understand like it sort of does, I wish that were the case. It's like, well, if you just don't talk about it, then it won't become a thing. Because I mean, the ironic part is like that was a name that Gamergaters, or you know, the worst Baldwin ever gave to this group, right? And so that's something that they sort of wave their flag with. Yeah, I mean, it's been a really, and I would never say that this was something that sort of like in a weird way, it's not good that it happened, but I think it forced people to acknowledge, like I can talk to like my parents about this, right? And it helps shine a broader light onto like a lot of these issues that have been around for a really, really long time. Whereas as opposed to like talking about sort of just generic, like terrible people on the internet, or it like allows people to say like, yeah, there are people who are like lives are being destroyed. Like that's a real thing. And it makes it more concrete to say, it's less mysterious if it's like the internet did it versus like, no, there's a concerted effort by a group of people to do really terrible things. Any other?
Hey, Jamin. I'm from Phoenix, and there's a bar in the downtown area, and they actually post, it's a really awesome bar, the general community loves it, and they actually post Yelp reviews of people who like ridiculously give them 1 star or 2 stars, like the napkins were a color I didn't like, or something crazy like that.
And they don't serve nachos, right, like at a French restaurant or whatever.
Exactly.
It's like 1 star, yeah.
But I was wondering, so they're making light of that negativity, right? Does that fall within, you said responding with love, right? Does that fall within that? Is making light of it kind of poking too much fun at them? Is that too negative and responding negativity with negativity, right?
Yeah, I mean, I think it really depends on, and again, not to keep referencing this Phelps article, but like, I think if it's part of like a longer engagement with a particular person, I think a lot of times what happens is, and it's hard because it's very seductive because it makes you feel good. It's like, yeah, this person is clearly being ridiculous. I think a lot of times what happens is like we sort of grab something and we laugh at it and then just kind of like move on. One of the things that Jeffrey Lynn at Riot Games has pointed out that is that binaries in terms of like moderation tend not to work very well. Is you just sort of like give people a thumbs up or a thumbs down. What happens is, since most people, at least in their particular community, aren't chronic, they're not like people who are constantly negative all the time, it actually makes them worse. And so I think if humor is one of these things that we use to sort of identify someone, kind of like cast them out, I think it will only make them, they're gonna flock to the group that is not going to tease them for whatever it is that they say. So that's the one thing. I mean, I think we do have to be like really careful, I guess. There's a way in which I think that we can do it that is, I think, maybe privately amusing, but I think if the goal is to like, I don't know, if the goal is to, I mean, again, back to the Martin Luther King quote, like the point is to like create shame in this person, but not like to publicly shame them or make them feel like they're a laughing stock, but more that they should feel like a moral shame for the position that they held. And there's other ways to go about doing that that don't involve like public ridicule. That said, just so ripe for jokes sometimes though, right? So I know it's too easy. It's too easy sometimes, but.
So the advice to not read the comments, I believe that's true unless you're the moderator, in which case you should read all of them. And I do on my YouTube channel. I get about 10,000 comments a year, so that's 30 a day that I'm reading.
Yeah.
And
Time you wish you could get back probably at some level.
actually, most of the comments are really nice, and I appreciate having that interaction with with earnest fans. But there are trolls, and usually if they're talking smack, I talk smack back because it's not hard to be smarter than a 14-year-old. And I usually get one of two responses. Either A, they're so unaccustomed to the person whose video they're criticizing responding that they get scared and go away.
Yeah.
Or B, they're so honored that the person that they're criticizing actually took the time to respond and is talking their language that the most common response I get is, hey man, you just got a new subscriber. So your first bullet point was always respond with love. In the context of YouTube comments, can you give me an example of what that would look like?
Yeah, I mean, that's a good one. I mean, I think engaging with people like for what it is that they're actually saying, right? I think there's a tendency sometimes, I mean, just asking why can be a really powerful kind of question. Like, you've laid this out there. I don't understand what it is that you're saying. Can you please explain why? Or providing counterfactuals. Or this might also be true. Sometimes I try to like rope in other commenters as well, which Google now allows you to do. So you can pull in other people if someone else has made a really, oh, you should check out this other comment that this other person made. But yeah, I think it's very time consuming. I think it's hard. That's the thing that's really hard, is that I can't have these like one-to-one interactions with everyone all the time. The hope is that like over time you create a culture in your comment section that allows other people to sort of, you know, kind of be miniature versions of you and help walk people through that stuff. But I think we definitely, game show included, could do a much better job in terms of like helping to train other people to have those responses. Love can take many different forms, right? So it's not always like hugs. Sometimes it can be like a really smart remark. Sometimes it can be a question. Got one up front? Okay, last question.
Would you say love is, I'm not sure how to put this, but would you say love is always a correct response, especially in communities where like they're very, like it's encouraged to be hostile, like certain live journals and certain subreddits?
Yeah, I mean, I guess I wouldn't have put a slide up if I didn't feel like it was true. I mean, I think there's a difference between like what is the right thing and what feels like the right thing, you know. And I think also I need to be like, I'm very trying to be honest about the fact that like I don't always do this, right? And I get angry and I get snide, and you know, I do read the comments sometimes, and I try, you know, to not lose my temper. I mean, it helps being like on a PBS show where it's like, if I completely flip out on somebody, for example, probably not a good thing. Like if Bob Ross was just like, right? Like,
well, it worked for Bill O'Reilly.
Yeah, exactly. Bill Nye's like, that's a stupid question. Leave me alone. At least that's kind of how he is now, though. Actually, Bill Nye's he's really going after people. So maybe when I'm done with game shows someday, then that can be a. Yeah, but to answer your question, I mean, I do feel like that's always the response, but I'm also like, you know, we're humans and we're not perfect, and things do bother us, and we're not always able to do that. But I do think in the long term, I think that that's the best long-term strategy. All right, thank you, everybody.
Thank you.